The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor of Le Bernardin, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where reservations were booked 6 months in advance and a single meal cost more than most people's monthly rent. Alexander Whitmore adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a nervous habit he'd developed during 30 years of billion-dollar negotiations, as he waited for his usual table in the private dining room. The maitre d', Henri, had been expecting him every Thursday at precisely 7:30 for the past 5 years, ever since Alexander's empire had grown large enough to warrant such ritualistic displays of wealth and power. But tonight felt different. The autumn rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights into abstract paintings of yellow and white. Alexander found himself studying these distortions with unusual intensity, as if they might reveal some hidden truth about the restlessness that had been gnawing at him for weeks. At 62, he commanded a technology conglomerate worth $47 billion, owned properties on 4 continents, and wielded influence that could topple governments or elevate unknown companies to global prominence. Yet lately, he'd been waking at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, feeling as hollow as the expensive wine bottles that lined his temperature-controlled cellar. "Mr. Whitmore, your table is ready," Henri announced, with the practiced deference that came from years of serving Manhattan's elite. But as they walked toward the private dining room, Henri paused, his usually composed expression flickering with uncertainty. "I must inform you, sir, that we have a new server tonight. Marie had a family emergency, and we've called in someone from our training program. I assure you she comes highly recommended, but if you prefer, I can personally attend to your needs this evening." Alexander waved dismissively, his mind already drifting toward the quarterly reports waiting on his desk. "It's fine, Henri. I'm sure she'll be adequate." He settled into his leather chair, the one positioned to give him a clear view of the park while keeping his back to the wall, a strategic habit formed during his early days in business when competitors had been less civilized in their attempts to gain advantage. The familiar ritual of ordering began. The 2005 Chateau d'Yquem, the pan-seared John Dory with its delicate saffron reduction, and the chocolate soufflé that would arrive precisely 90 minutes later, timed to perfection. The new waitress approached with a slight tremor in her hands, carrying the wine with the careful precision of someone still learning the choreography of high-end service. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed and fitted perfectly, but Alexander noticed she wore no jewelry except for a small silver cross that caught the chandelier light as she moved. There was something about her posture, proud despite her obvious nervousness, that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. I'm Elena, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. I have your wine selection here, a 2005 Chateau d'Yquem. Would you like me to pour?" Her movements were graceful as she presented the bottle, but Alexander found himself studying her face rather than focusing on the wine's golden amber color or its renowned reputation. Something about the shape of her eyes, the way her mouth curved slightly upward even when she was concentrating, it tugged at a memory he thought he'd buried so deep it could never surface. "That's fine," he managed, though his usual composure was beginning to crack. As Elena leaned forward to pour the wine, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing her left wrist. And there, just above the delicate bones of her hand, was a birthmark that Alexander's world tilted on its axis. The mark was distinctive, a crescent moon-shaped with what looked like a small star beside it, colored in a deep burgundy that stood out against her pale skin. It was exactly the same size, the same shape, the same impossible configuration that he had memorized 23 years ago. The wine glass slipped from Alexander's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal fragments and golden liquid. The sound seemed to echo through the restaurant like a gunshot, drawing startled glances from other diners and causing Henri to appear instantly at the table with a look of mortified concern. But Alexander barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Elena's wrist, on that impossible mark that couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, because the only person who had ever worn it was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, under a headstone that read Isabella Marie Santos, 1978 to 2001. "Sir, are you all right?" Elena asked, genuine concern replacing her professional demeanor as she knelt to help gather the larger pieces of crystal. But as she looked up at him, Alexander saw something flicker in her eyes, a flash of recognition that lasted only a moment before being replaced by confusion. "Your wrist," Alexander whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the restaurant. "That mark on your wrist." Elena glanced down at her birthmark, then back at his face, and for a heartbeat they simply stared at each other across a chasm of 23 years and impossible circumstances. "I've had it since birth," she said carefully, as if sensing that something more significant than a broken wine glass had just occurred. "My adoptive parents always said it looked like a moon and star. They used to tell me it meant I was destined for something special, though I never felt particularly—" "Adoptive parents?" The words escaped Alexander's lips like a prayer or a curse. Henri was hovering nearby, clearly wanting to intervene but uncertain how to navigate what was obviously a deeply personal moment. Other staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding at table 12.
Elena nodded slowly, her storm-colored eyes never leaving his face. "I was adopted as an infant. My parents, my adoptive parents, found me through Catholic charities when I was just 3 months old. They said my birth mother was very young, that she died in an accident shortly after I was born. They never told me much more than that, said the records were sealed and it would be better for me to focus on the future rather than dwelling on a past I couldn't change." The restaurant seemed to fade around them, the elegant ambiance and sophisticated chatter becoming a distant backdrop to a conversation that was reshaping everything Alexander thought he knew about his life. He reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers, withdrawing his phone and scrolling through photos until he found the one he'd been carrying like a talisman for over 2 decades. It was a Polaroid, faded with age, showing a young woman with dark hair and storm-colored eyes, her left wrist clearly visible as she reached toward the camera. The crescent moon birthmark with its accompanying star was unmistakable. "This is Isabella Santos," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion as he held the phone toward Elena. "She would have been your age now. She was 19 when she died in a car accident in Queens. I was 39, just starting to build my company, and she was going to change everything." He paused, studying Elena's face as she looked at the photograph. "She was pregnant when she died, 3 months pregnant. The doctors said the baby couldn't be saved." Elena's face went pale as she stared at the image, her hand unconsciously moving to touch her birthmark. She looks exactly like me, but that's impossible. The timeline doesn't match. I was born in 1998, and if she died in 2001, "The official report said the baby died with her," Alexander interrupted, his mind racing through possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. But what if it didn't? What if someone, the doctors, the hospital, someone in authority, what if they lied? He was standing now, pacing in the small space beside the table, drawing curious stares from other diners who had never seen the composed billionaire Alexander Whitmore display anything resembling raw emotion. Henry approached cautiously, wringing his hands. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should move this conversation to somewhere more private. The wine cellar has a small tasting room that would offer more discretion. But Alexander barely heard him. He was studying Elena's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. "What was your birth date?" Alexander asked suddenly. "March 15th, 1998, Elena replied automatically, then seemed to realize the significance of her answer. "But wait, that would mean if your Isabella died in 2001 and I was born in 1998, then she couldn't have been my mother, unless—" She trailed off, her expression shifting as she began to process the implications. Unless someone changed the dates, unless someone wanted to make sure that a billionaire's potential heir disappeared completely into the system. He sat down heavily, the weight of 23 years of grief and guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. Isabella never told me she was pregnant. Our relationship was complicated. I was married then, unhappily, but married nonetheless. She was working as a paralegal at a law firm that did contract work for my company. We met during a corporate merger, and despite all the reasons why we shouldn't have been together, we fell in love. Elena sank into the chair across from him, her professional composure completely forgotten. "You think someone at the hospital falsified records, made it seem like I died so that I could be quietly adopted, and no one would ever connect me to you? It wouldn't be the first time powerful people have manipulated the system to avoid scandal or unwanted complications," Alexander said bitterly. "In 2001, I was just beginning to attract serious media attention. A love child from an affair could have been devastating, especially since Isabella wasn't from our social circle. Someone might have thought they were protecting me or protecting their own interests by making sure you disappeared." The implications hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and consumption, but their corner of the world had become suspended in time, weighted with questions that would demand answers and truths that would shatter carefully constructed lives. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she looked again at the photograph of Isabella. "She's beautiful, and she looks so young. If she was my mother, if you were—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the possibility floated between them, too enormous and fragile to be spoken out loud yet. "I need to know the truth," Alexander said firmly, his business instincts finally overriding his emotional turmoil. "I have resources, connections, ways to find out what really happened. But Elena, if we pursue this, if we dig into the past and uncover what was hidden, it will change everything. Are you prepared for that?" Elena straightened in her chair, and Alexander glimpsed something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of Isabella, a determination that ran deeper than fear, a strength that had been forged by years of unanswered questions. "I've spent my whole life wondering who I really was, where I came from. My adoptive parents were wonderful, don't misunderstand me, but there was this empty space, this sense that part of my story was missing. If there's a chance to fill that space, to understand why I've always felt like I was searching for something I couldn't name, then yes, I'm ready."
The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with October wind rattling the windows of Elena's cramped studio apartment in Astoria, Queens. She'd barely slept, tossing restlessly on sheets that smelled faintly of the lavender detergent her adoptive mother, Carmen Morales, had taught her to use. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Isabella Santos's face in that faded Polaroid, so achingly similar to her own reflection that it felt like looking at a ghost who'd been wearing her identity for 25 years. Elena's morning routine was a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency born from necessity. She shared the building's single bathroom with 3 other tenants, which meant her shower slot was precisely 6:47 a.m., timed to avoid Mrs. Chen's lengthy beauty regimen and Miguel's tendency to leave damp towels everywhere. The apartment itself was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed that folded into the wall and a kitchenette where she could touch both the refrigerator and the stove simultaneously. But it was hers,
paid for with tips from Le Bernardin and her weekend shifts at a diner in Jackson Heights, and she decorated it with treasures salvaged from thrift stores and flea markets. A vintage mirror framed in tarnished silver, plants that thrived despite the limited sunlight, and books stacked in towers that served as both library and furniture. As she dressed for her day shift at the diner, Elena found herself studying her reflection with new eyes. She'd always been told she looked exotic, a word that had followed her through childhood like a question mark. Her adoptive parents, Carmen and Roberto Morales, were both second-generation Mexican-Americans with warm brown skin and dark eyes that crinkled the corners when they laughed. "Mija, you're beautiful like a movie star," Carmen would say whenever Elena expressed frustration about standing out in family photos. "God gave you those looks for a reason." But now, holding her phone up to compare her reflection to Isabella's photograph, Elena wondered if the reason might be more complicated than divine providence. The resemblance was uncanny. Not just the birthmark, but the shape of her nose, the curve of her mouth, the way her eyebrows arched naturally without plucking. If Alexander Whitmore was right, if the impossible was actually true, then everything she'd believed about her identity was built on a foundation of lies and falsified documents. The diner where Elena worked her second job was called Stella's, a throwback to the 1950s with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that actually played 45s. The owner, Stella Kowalski, was a 60-year-old Polish immigrant who'd bought the place with her late husband's life insurance money and ran it with the iron fist of someone who understood that success came from treating every customer like family, even the difficult ones. Elena had been working there for 3 years, ever since she'd moved out of Carmen and Roberto's house in the Bronx, and Stella had become something of a mentor, teaching her the art of reading customers' moods in their posture and adjusting her service accordingly. "You look like someone walked over your grave," Stella observed as Elena tied her apron with more force than necessary. The morning rush was just beginning, with construction workers grabbing coffee and egg sandwiches before heading to job sites across the city. "Rough night at the fancy place?" Elena had always confided in Stella about the challenges of working in fine dining, the pressure, the demanding clientele, the way some customers treated service staff like furniture. But how could she explain that last night's encounter had potentially rewritten her entire life story? Instead, she busied herself with checking the coffee levels and arranging the sugar dispensers in perfect rows. "Just tired," she said, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue. Stella's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled, but the older woman simply nodded and began cracking eggs on the griddle with practiced efficiency. The morning passed in a blur of orders and small talk. Elena found herself moving through familiar motions while her mind churned through possibilities and implications. If Alexander Whitmore was her father, and the thought still felt too enormous to fully grasp, then what did that mean for her relationship with Carmen and Roberto? They'd given her everything they could, working double shifts at the textile factory to pay for her Catholic school education, celebrating every small achievement as if she'd won the Nobel Prize. Carmen still called every Sunday evening without fail, asking about her job, her health, whether she was eating enough vegetables. Roberto had taught her to change a tire and balance a checkbook, skills that had served her well in navigating adult independence. During her lunch break, Elena found herself walking through the small park behind the diner, her phone heavy in her pocket. Alexander Whitmore had given her his private number before she left the restaurant, along with a promise to begin investigating the circumstances of her birth. He'd start with the hospital records, he said, his businessman's composure masking what she'd glimpsed as deep emotional turmoil. "And the adoption agency. Someone knows the truth, and I intend to find them." But Elena realized that she needed to do some investigation of her own, starting with the people who'd raised her. Carmen and Roberto had always been vague about the details of her adoption, claiming that the social worker had advised them to focus on building their new family rather than dwelling on circumstances that couldn't be changed. At the time, it had seemed like loving protection. Now, Elena wondered if there were details they'd deliberately hidden. She dialed her adoptive mother's number, her heart racing as the phone rang. Carmen picked up on the third ring, her voice bright with the pleasure it always carried when Elena called unexpectedly.
"Mija,
What a beautiful surprise. I was just thinking about you this morning. Mrs. Rodriguez at the market asked about you. Wanted to know if you're still working at that fancy restaurant. I told her my daughter serves millionaires and celebrities, that she's making something of herself in Manhattan. Mom, Elena began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the affection in Carmen's voice. How could she ask questions that might suggest her adoptive parents had been lying to her for 25 years? I wanted to ask you something about when I was little, about my adoption. The silence that followed was so long, Elena wondered if the call had dropped. When Carmen spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, careful, guarded in a way Elena had never heard before. Why are you asking about this now, mija? You know we've told you everything we can remember. It was so long ago, and honestly, your father and I, we were so focused on learning how to be parents, we didn't pay much attention to all the paperwork and legal details. I know, but I was wondering about the dates. When exactly was I born? And do you remember anything about my birth mother? About how she died? Another pause, longer this time. Elena could hear the television in the background, one of Carmen's telenovelas playing at low volume, and the sound of her father's tools in his workshop. Normal sounds of the life she'd grown up in, now feeling somehow distant and fragile. Elena, honey, why don't you come for dinner this weekend? We can look through the old papers together, see what we still have. Some things are better discussed in person, you know? The evasion confirmed Elena's growing suspicions. Carmen, who could remember the exact date of every birthday, anniversary, and Saint's Day for the past 30 years, was suddenly vague about details surrounding the most important event in their family's history. Okay, Mom, I'll come Sunday after my shift at Stella's. And Mom, I love you. You know that, right? No matter what we find in those papers, you and Dad are my parents. That will never change. Carmen's voice broke slightly as she responded. I love you too, mija. More than you could ever know. We'll talk on Sunday, okay? After ending the call, Elena sat on a park bench watching sparrows fight over breadcrumbs scattered by an elderly man who visited every day at precisely noon. The simple scene, birds squabbling over resources while a lonely person found a purpose in feeding them, felt like a metaphor for something she couldn't quite articulate. Everyone was just trying to survive, to find meaning and connection wherever they could, even if it meant accepting scraps or partial truths. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Elena, this is Alexander Whitmore. I've made appointments with a private investigator and genealogist who specializes in adoption cases. Could you meet me tomorrow evening at my office? I understand this is overwhelming, but I believe we need to pursue this systematically. Whatever we discover, I want you to know that I'll support you through the process. Elena stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Yes, I need to know the truth, whatever it is. Thank you for understanding how difficult this is. As she walked back to Stella's for the afternoon shift, Elena found herself noticing details she'd previously taken for granted. The way afternoon sunlight filtered through the narrow spaces between buildings, creating patterns of light and shadow on the sidewalk. The smell of roasted coffee drifting from a bodega where the owner was experimenting with new blends. The sound of children playing in a schoolyard, their voices carrying the uncomplicated joy of people whose identities were never in question. For the first time in her life, Elena felt the weight of not knowing who she truly was. It wasn't just about biological parents or genetic heritage. It was about the fundamental question of whether the story she'd been living was real or constructed, whether her sense of self was built on truth or on well-intentioned deception. You're moving like you're underwater, Stella observed when Elena returned, tying her apron with hands that trembled slightly. Whatever's bothering you, it's bigger than just being tired. You want to talk about it? Elena looked at the older woman who'd been a constant source of practical wisdom and unconditional support. Stella had immigrated to America with nothing but determination and a recipe for pierogi that could make grown men cry with nostalgia. She'd built a successful business through sheer force of will and an understanding that sometimes people needed more than just food. They needed a place where they could be themselves without judgment. What would you do if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about your life was wrong? Elena asked quietly. Stella considered the question seriously while she wiped down the counter with methodical precision. I would decide what mattered more, the truth about the past or the life I was building for the future. Sometimes, mija, the facts are less important than what you choose to do with them. The afternoon rush brought its usual chaos. Office workers grabbing late lunches, teenagers sharing French fries and gossip, and elderly regulars who ordered the same thing every day and left exact change plus a dollar tip. She served them all with her customary efficiency, but part of her attention remained focused on the questions that had no easy answers. If Alexander Whitmore was her biological father, what did that mean for her daily reality? Would she still need to work 2 jobs to pay rent? Would she still find satisfaction in the simple pleasure of making someone's day better with exceptional service? More importantly, if Isabella Santos was her biological mother, what did that mean for the woman who died so young, never knowing what happened to her child?
Throughout the afternoon, wondering what she'd been like beyond the single photograph. Had she been funny? Did she sing while she worked? What were her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future she'd never get to see? As the sun began to set over Queens, painting the diner's windows in shades of amber and gold, Elena realized that regardless of what the investigation revealed, she was no longer the same person who'd walked into Le Bernardin 24 hours earlier. The questions had been asked, the possibilities acknowledged, and there was no going back to the comfortable uncertainty she'd lived with for 25 years. Whatever the truth turned out to be, she was going to face it with the strength Carmen and Roberto had taught her, the resilience she'd learned from working multiple jobs, and the hope that understanding her past might finally help her build a future that felt authentically her own. Alexander Whitmore's private office occupied the entire 52nd floor of the Whitmore building, a gleaming testament to architectural ambition and financial success that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a steel and glass arrow. The space was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of the city, a conference table carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, and walls lined with awards, honorary degrees, and photographs of Alexander shaking hands with presidents, prime ministers, and Nobel Prize winners. But as Elena stepped off the private elevator the next evening, she felt less intimidated than overwhelmed by the gulf between her world and this one. Miss Morales, Alexander's assistant Patricia greeted her with professional warmth. Patricia had been Alexander's gatekeeper for 15 years, a woman whose impeccable judgment and absolute discretion had made her one of the most powerful assistants in Manhattan's business community. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting for you in the small conference room. Can I offer you coffee, tea, or water?" The small conference room was larger than Elena's entire apartment, with a round table that suggested collaboration rather than hierarchy. Alexander rose as she entered, and Elena noticed he looked older than he had at the restaurant, as if the possibility of discovering a daughter had aged him overnight. He'd traded his usual business suit for casual slacks and a sweater, an attempt at approachability that somehow made him seem more human and more formidable simultaneously. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward a chair across from where several manila folders lay organized with military precision. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Dr. Sarah Chen to join us. She's a forensic genealogist who specializes in cases involving questionable documentation and hidden family connections. Her work has helped solve some very complex situations." Dr. Chen was a compact Asian-American woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of composed confidence that came from years of unraveling other people's family secrets. "Ms. Morales, I've spent the past 18 hours reviewing the preliminary information Mr. Whitmore provided, and I must say, this case presents some very unusual circumstances. Before we begin, I want you to understand that genealogical investigation, particularly when it involves potential falsified records, can be emotionally challenging. Are you prepared for the possibility that we might uncover information that contradicts everything you've been told about your origins?" Elena settled into her chair, drawing on the composure she'd learned from years of dealing with demanding customers. I've been preparing for that possibility since last night. I need to know the truth, whatever it is. Dr. Chen opened the first folder, revealing photocopies of official documents, birth certificates, death certificates, adoption records, and hospital forms. Let's start with what we know for certain. According to public records, Isabella Santos died in a car accident on March 18, 2001, at age 23. The death certificate lists her as 3 months pregnant at the time of death, with the fetus listed as not viable. However, when I cross-referenced this with hospital records from Queens General, I found several inconsistencies. She spread out a series of documents pointing to specific dates and signatures with a red pen. The original intake form from the emergency room shows Isabella was brought in unconscious but alive. The initial examination noted that while she had sustained serious injuries, her vital signs were stable. More importantly, the obstetric notes indicate that the fetus was showing strong heartbeat and normal development for approximately 14 weeks gestation. Alexander leaned forward, his business-trained mind immediately grasping the implications. You're saying she and the baby were both alive when they reached the hospital. Not only alive, but with excellent chances of survival according to the initial medical assessment. Isabella had a concussion, 2 broken ribs, and a fractured wrist, but nothing that should have been fatal with proper treatment. The pregnancy appeared completely unaffected by the accident. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as she processed this information. So, what happened? Why do the death certificates say both she and the baby died? Dr. Chen turned to a new set of documents, these bearing different signatures and timestamps. This is where the story becomes very interesting. Approximately 6 hours after Isabella's admission, there was a series of administrative changes to her case. Her emergency contact information was updated, her insurance coverage was modified, and most significantly, her attending physician was changed from Dr. Maria Santos, no relation, to Dr. Richard Blackwood. "I know that name," Alexander said grimly. Richard Blackwood was the chief of obstetrics at Queens General. He also sat on the board of Whitmore Industries Charitable Foundation, and his wife was one of my ex-wife's closest friends. If someone wanted to manage a delicate situation involving my personal life, Blackwood would have been a logical choice to approach. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Elena found herself gripping the edge of the conference table, her knuckles white with tension. "Are you saying that Dr. Blackwood deliberately falsified records to cover up what really happened?"
I'm saying that the medical evidence suggests a very different outcome than what was officially recorded, Dr. Chen replied carefully. Isabella Santos was discharged from Queens General on March 20, 2001, 2 days after the accident. But according to public records, she died on March 18th. The death certificate was filed by Dr. Blackwood personally, which is unusual. Typically, that paperwork would be handled by administrative staff. Alexander stood and began pacing, a habit Elena was beginning to recognize as his way of processing complex information. But if Isabella survived, where did she go? And what happened to her baby? Dr. Chen opened another folder, this one containing Elena's adoption records. According to Catholic Charities of New York, Elena was placed with the Morales family on June 15, 1998, when she was approximately 3 months old. Her birth mother is listed as Maria Santos, deceased, with no father identified. The birth date on these documents is March 15, 1998. But, Elena, when we compare the handwriting on these forms with other documents from the same time period, there are significant inconsistencies. Elena studied the photocopied forms, noting the different pen weights and slightly varied handwriting styles Dr. Chen was indicating. Someone altered these documents after they were initially filled out? More likely, someone created entirely new documents using information from the originals as a template, but changing key details like dates and names to obscure the connection to Isabella's case. The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic 52 floors below.
Elena felt as if she were watching her life story be rewritten in real time, each revelation shifting the foundation of everything she'd believed about her identity. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued, opening a final folder. "I was able to track down some of the personnel who worked at Queen's General in 2001. Most were reluctant to discuss specific cases due to privacy concerns, but one nurse, Margaret Flynn, agreed to speak with me off the record. She retired in 2015 and now lives in Florida. According to Miss Flynn, there were several unusual births during that period, cases where healthy babies were reported as stillborn, but she witnessed them being removed from the maternity ward alive." Alexander stopped pacing, his face darkening with anger. "You're describing an organized system for falsifying birth and death records. But why? What would be the motivation for such an elaborate deception?" "Money, reputation, and power," Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly. "In 2001, Mr. Whitmore, you were on the verge of taking your company public. A scandal involving an extramarital affair and a child born out of wedlock could have cost you hundreds of millions of dollars in stock valuations. Someone, perhaps Dr. Blackwood, perhaps someone else with access to both your personal information and the hospital's records, may have decided to eliminate the potential problem by making it disappear entirely." Elena felt sick to her stomach as she realized the full scope of what might have been done. So Isabella didn't die in the accident? Based on the evidence we've uncovered so far, Isabella Santos was very much alive when she left Queen's General. What happened to her after that is still unclear, but I have some theories we can pursue. Alexander turned to face Elena, his expression mixing hope and anguish. "If she survived, if she's still alive somewhere, then we need to find her. You need to know your mother." But Dr. Chen's expression was cautious. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to prepare both of you for the possibility that while Isabella may have survived the accident and given birth, she might not have survived whatever happened afterward. People who are willing to falsify death certificates and manipulate hospital records to protect powerful individuals are capable of taking more drastic measures to ensure their secrets remain hidden." The weight of this possibility settled over them like a shroud. Elena had spent 25 years believing her biological mother was dead, and now she was being told that Isabella might have been murdered to protect Alexander's reputation and business interests. "What's our next step?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "We need to find Margaret Flynn and get her full testimony about what she witnessed," Alexander said, his businessman's instincts taking over. "We need to track down Dr. Blackwood, if he's still alive, and confront him with what we've discovered. And we need to find out what happened to Isabella after she left the hospital." Dr. Chen nodded. "I've already located Dr. Blackwood. He's 78 years old and lives in a retirement community in Westchester. He's been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which could complicate matters, but it might also make him more willing to speak about events he's kept secret for over 20 years. As the meeting concluded, Elena felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were uncovering. She wasn't just discovering her biological parents, she was potentially exposing a conspiracy that had separated her from her mother and stolen 23 years of their lives together.
"Elena," Alexander said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to know that regardless of what we discover about Isabella, I intend to do everything in my power to make amends for what was done. If people acting in my interests or thinking they were protecting me caused you and your mother to be separated, then I bear responsibility for that." Elena studied his face, seeing genuine remorse alongside determination. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore, but right now I just want to find the truth. Everything else we can figure out afterward." As Elena rode the elevator down from the 52nd floor, she realized that her life had irrevocably changed course. She was no longer just a waitress working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She was potentially the daughter of one of the most powerful men in America and the victim of a conspiracy that had robbed her of her biological mother. The questions were no longer just about her identity. They were about justice, truth, and the possibility that someone had literally gotten away with murder to protect a billionaire's reputation. The investigation had only just begun, but Elena could already feel the weight of powerful forces that had been set in motion 23 years ago, forces that might not welcome the light being shed on their carefully buried secrets. The next morning brought Elena's first glimpse into the reach of Alexander Whitmore's influence. She arrived at Stella's diner to find two men in expensive suits sitting in the corner booth, nursing coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. They weren't eating, weren't reading newspapers, and their eyes followed her movements with the practiced attention of people paid to watch and report. When she approached their table to offer fresh coffee, one of them, a man with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from country club golf courses, spoke in a voice that carried quiet authority. "Elena Morales, we'd like a word with you when you have a moment." Stella emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and fixing the strangers with the skeptical glare she reserved for health inspectors and ex-husbands. "This is a place of business, not a meeting hall. You want to talk to my girl, you order food and pay your tab like everyone else." The second man, younger with sharp features and calculating eyes, reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the table. "Miss Morales, my name is David Sinclair. I represent certain interests that may be affected by your recent discoveries. We'd very much appreciate a private conversation." Elena picked up the card, which identified Sinclair as a partner at Morrison Blackwell & Associates, a law firm she didn't recognize but that carried the kind of understated elegance that screamed money and power. "I'm working right now. If you want to talk to me, you can make an appointment like anyone else." The silver-haired man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Morales, I think you may not fully understand the complexity of the situation you've stumbled into. There are reputations at stake, business relationships that have been carefully maintained for decades, and financial interests that extend far beyond what you might imagine. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." "Is that a threat?" Elena asked, loud enough that other customers began turning in their direction. Stella moved closer, positioning herself protectively beside Elena's shoulder. "It's practical advice," Sinclair replied smoothly. "You have a good life here, honest work, people who care about you, a future you can build through your own efforts. Sometimes when we go looking for different truths, we end up losing the good things we already have." The implication was clear: pursue this investigation and face consequences. Elena felt anger flare in her chest, not just at the thinly veiled intimidation, but at the arrogance of people who believed they could manipulate her life just as they might have manipulated her birth. "Gentlemen, I think you should leave now. My customers are trying to enjoy their breakfast in peace." The two men exchanged a look that suggested this wasn't the response they had expected. As they stood to leave, Sinclair placed a $50 bill on the table, far more than their coffee was worth, a gesture that felt more like a bribe than a tip. "We'll be in touch, Miss Morales, and please give our regards to Mr. Whitmore. Tell him that some partnerships are too valuable to risk over ancient history." After they left, Stella pulled Elena aside, her usually cheerful expression clouded with concern. "Mija, those weren't the kind of men who give up easy. Whatever you've gotten yourself involved in, it's big enough that people with serious money are worried about it. You need to be careful." Elena nodded, but her resolve was only strengthened by the encounter. If powerful people were trying to intimidate her to drop the investigation, it meant they had something significant to hide. She called Alexander immediately, describing the visit from Sinclair and his companion. His response was swift and angry. "They're trying to threaten you? That confirms we're on the right track, but it also means we need to move faster. I'm hiring security for you, Elena, and I'm calling my own lawyers. If someone thinks they can intimidate my daughter—" He stopped abruptly, as if surprised by his own words. "Your daughter?" Elena repeated softly. "I'm sorry. I know we don't have proof yet, but Elena, every instinct I have tells me you're Isabella's child, which means you're mine too, and no one threatens my family."
The word family hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the investigation, on uncovering the truth about her past, that she hadn't fully processed what that truth might mean for her future. If Alexander Whitmore was her father, she wasn't just gaining answers, she was gaining a parent, with all the complicated emotions that relationship would entail. That evening, Dr. Chen called with an update that made everything more urgent. "I've been in contact with Margaret Flynn, the retired nurse from Queen's General. She's agreed to meet with us, but she's frightened. Apparently, she received a phone call this afternoon from someone claiming to represent Dr. Blackwood's legal team, asking about her communications with genealogists. Someone is monitoring our investigation." "How is that possible?" Elena asked. "Hospital records, even old ones, are typically stored in databases that can be accessed by people with the right credentials and connections. If Dr. Blackwood or his associates have maintained influence at Queen's General, they could be tracking anyone who requests information about cases from 2001. Alexander's voice was grim when he joined the conference call. Elena was approached today by lawyers representing certain interests. They're not even trying to hide the fact that they're watching us. "Then we need to accelerate our timeline," Dr. Chen replied. "Miss Flynn has agreed to meet tomorrow afternoon, but she wants to do it somewhere public and safe. She suggested the main branch of the New York Public Library, lots of people around, security cameras, and multiple exits if she feels threatened." Elena found herself thinking about Margaret Flynn, a woman who had spent her career caring for mothers and babies, now frightened into silence about something she'd witnessed decades ago. How many other people knew pieces of the truth, but had been too scared to speak? How many lives had been affected by the conspiracy that had stolen her from Isabella? The next afternoon, Elena and Alexander met Dr. Chen at the library's main entrance on Fifth Avenue. Margaret Flynn was waiting for them in the Rose Main reading room, a 70-year-old woman with silver hair and eyes that held the weary wisdom of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. She wore a simple blue dress and clutched a worn leather purse as if it contained her life's most precious possessions. "Miss Flynn, thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Dr. Chen said as they settled at a table surrounded by researchers and students. "I know this is difficult." Margaret Flynn studied Elena's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You look just like her," she said quietly. "Isabella Santos. I'll never forget her face because of what happened afterward. It haunted me for years." "What did you see?" Elena asked gently. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper as she began to speak. "Isabella came in after the car accident, conscious and talking. She was worried about her baby, kept asking if everything was okay. Dr. Santos, the first doctor, ran all the tests and said both mother and baby were fine. Isabella was relieved, said she was planning to call the baby's father after she was discharged." "But then something changed," Alexander prompted. "Dr. Blackwood arrived around midnight with 2 other men I didn't recognize. They weren't medical personnel, they wore expensive suits and had the kind of authority that comes from outside the hospital. Dr. Blackwood took over Isabella's case personally, which was unusual. He moved her to a private room on the 3rd floor away from the regular maternity ward." Margaret paused, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "The next morning, Isabella was gone. Dr. Blackwood told us she died during the night from complications, but I'd checked on her at 6 a.m. and she was fine, alert, talking about names for her baby. And there was no body to prepare, no family to notify. Everything was handled administratively." Elena felt sick. "What about the baby?" "That's the part that still gives me nightmares," Margaret continued. 3 days later, a healthy infant girl was brought to the nursery. The paperwork said she was a surrendered newborn, mother unknown, but I recognized her immediately. She had the same unusual birthmark I'd noticed on Isabella's wrist, a crescent moon with a star. I tried to ask questions, but Dr. Blackwood made it clear that discussing the case would be grounds for immediate termination. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Elena had been separated from Isabella not through death, but through a deliberate conspiracy that had stolen her from Isabella. "Miss Flynn," Alexander said carefully, "do you have any idea what happened to Isabella after she left the hospital?" Margaret's expression grew even more troubled. "I can't prove anything, but there were rumors among the staff.
stories about private facilities where wealthy families sent inconvenient relatives, places that weren't on any official medical registries. Dr. Blackwood had connections to several such institutions. If someone
"Must admit, this is highly unusual," Dr. Foster said, studying the paternity test results Alexander had expedited through a private laboratory. "Isabella Santos has been with us for over 2 decades, and in all that time, she's never had visitors. Her care has been arranged through a trust fund administered by a law firm with explicit instructions that she was to have no contact with the outside world." "What was her supposed diagnosis?" Dr. Chen asked. "Severe traumatic brain injury resulting in cognitive impairment and violent tendencies," Dr. Foster replied, consulting a thick file. "According to her intake records, she was transferred here from Queens General after becoming unmanageable in a standard hospital setting. The recommendation was for permanent custodial care with minimal stimulation to prevent aggressive episodes." Elena felt anger building in her chest. Has she ever actually displayed violent behavior during her time here? Dr. Foster's pause was telling. "No, actually. Isabella has been one of our most cooperative residents. She participates in art therapy, helps in the garden, and has never shown any signs of aggression towards staff or other residents. To be honest, many of us have questioned whether her diagnosis was accurate, but the legal arrangements for her care have always been very specific about maintaining her current status." "We'd like to see her," Alexander said firmly. "As her family, we have the right to evaluate her condition ourselves." Dr. Foster nodded slowly. "Of course, but I should prepare you. After 23 years of institutionalization, Isabella may not respond normally to unexpected visitors. She's built a very structured life here, and sudden changes can be disorienting." They followed Dr. Foster through corridors lined with artwork created by residents, watercolor landscapes, pottery pieces, and oil paintings that spoke to minds that were far from impaired. Elena found herself studying each piece, wondering if any had been created by the mother she was about to meet for the first time in her adult life. Isabella Santos was sitting in a sun-drenched conservatory, tending to a collection of orchids with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to find meaning in small, beautiful things. She was 46 now, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, but Elena recognized her immediately from the photograph Alexander had carried for 23 years. She was older, thinner, marked by decades of institutional life, but unmistakably the woman who'd given birth to her. "Isabella," Dr. Foster said gently, "you have some visitors today. This is Alexander Whitmore and Elena Morales. They have some questions about your time here." Isabella looked up from her orchids, and Elena saw her own storm-colored eyes reflected back at her with startling clarity. For a moment, her expression was polite but distant, the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from human interaction. But then her gaze focused on Elena's face, and something shifted. "You have my eyes," Isabella said quietly, her voice carrying only a slight tremor from years of minimal conversation. "And you're the right age. Are you—" She stopped, as if afraid to voice the hope that had sustained her for over 22 years. Elena knelt beside Isabella's chair, her own hands trembling as she reached out to take her mother's fingers stained with soil from the orchids, calloused from years of gardening and art therapy. "I'm Elena. I think I'm your daughter." Isabella's composure shattered. Years of carefully controlled emotion poured out as she pulled Elena into an embrace that felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. "They told me you died," Isabella whispered against Elena's hair. "The doctors said the accident. They said I lost you, but I never believed it, not completely. I kept having dreams that you were alive somewhere, growing up without me." Alexander stood nearby, witness to a reunion that was both joyful and heartbreaking. Dr. Chen was quietly recording everything on her phone, documenting evidence of a conspiracy that had stolen 23 years from a mother and daughter. "Isabella," Alexander said gently, approaching so she could see his face clearly. "Do you remember me? Alexander Whitmore. We were together before the accident." Isabella studied his face, and Elena watched as recognition dawned. "Alex, you look older, but I'd know those eyes anywhere. I was going to tell you about the baby. I was planning to call you from the hospital, but then everything went wrong." "What do you remember about that night?" Dr. Chen asked carefully.
Isabella's expression darkened as she recalled memories she'd probably spent years trying to understand. The accident itself was a blur. Another car ran a red light and hit me. But I remember being conscious in the ambulance, worried about the baby, but thinking everything would be okay. The first doctor at the hospital said we were both fine, that I could go home in a day or two. She paused, her hands unconsciously moving to her abdomen, as if she could still feel the pregnancy that had been stolen from her. Then Dr. Blackwood came in with these other men. They said there had been complications, that I needed special treatment. They moved me to a different room, and the next thing I remember clearly is waking up here, being told that I'd had a breakdown after losing my baby and that I needed long-term care to recover. "They've been lying to you for 23 years, Elena said, anger and grief warring in her voice. "I didn't die. They took me away and had me adopted. You've been kept here under false pretenses while I grew up thinking my mother was dead." The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Isabella had been silenced not through murder, but through institutional imprisonment, diagnosed with conditions she didn't have, and kept from the outside world to prevent her from ever contacting Alexander or discovering what had happened to her child. Dr. Foster, who had been listening with growing alarm, spoke up. "If what you're saying is true, then this facility has been party to unlawful imprisonment. The legal and ethical implications are staggering." "Who arranged for Isabella's care here? Who's been paying for her stay all these years?" Alexander asked. Dr. Foster consulted her files again. "The arrangements were made by Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, the same law firm that's handled all administrative matters related to her case. They've been very explicit about maintaining strict confidentiality and preventing any outside contact." Elena felt the pieces clicking into place. Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, the same firm whose representative had tried to intimidate her at the diner. They weren't just trying to cover up the conspiracy, they actively been maintaining it for over 2 decades. "Isabella," Elena said, taking her mother's hands again, "how much do you remember about your life before the accident, about your relationship with Alexander?" Isabella smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, an expression that transformed her face and made her look years younger. "I remember everything. I was working as a paralegal at Henderson and Mills, doing contract work for Alexander's company. We met during a negotiation session, and despite all the reasons why we shouldn't have been together, we fell in love. I knew he was married, knew it was complicated, but what we had felt real and important. I found out I was pregnant about 2 weeks before the accident. I was terrified, but also excited. I kept imagining what our child would look like, whether she'd have your business sense or my stubborn streak. I was planning to tell you the next day, was going to suggest we figure out a way to make it work despite the complications." Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he responded. "I left my wife 6 months after the accident. I couldn't stop thinking about you, couldn't understand why you disappeared from my life so completely. If I'd known you were alive, if I'd known about Elena, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." The reunion continued for hours. 23 years of separation being gradually bridged through shared memories, explanations, and the simple miracle of being in the same room together. Elena learned that Isabella had been a voracious reader before her imprisonment, that she dreamed of traveling to Italy to study Renaissance art, that she taught herself 3 languages during her college years. Isabella learned that Elena had inherited her love of books and her determination to build something meaningful from whatever life offered. As afternoon faded into evening, Dr. Chen began discussing the legal steps necessary to secure Isabella's immediate release from Serenity Hills. The facility will need to conduct their own investigation into how this situation was allowed to continue for so long. There will be criminal charges filed against multiple parties and civil lawsuits that could take years to resolve. But Elena was focused on simpler, more immediate concerns. "Mom,
she said, testing the word and finding it felt natural despite the extraordinary circumstances. What do you want to do now? Where do you want to go? Isabella looked around the conservatory that had been her prison for 23 years, then at the daughter she'd never been allowed to raise and the man she'd never stopped loving. I want to go home, she said simply. Wherever that is now, whoever I'm going to be in the outside world, I want to start living again instead of just surviving. As they prepared to leave Serenity Hills, Isabella would be released the next day after legal formalities were completed. Elena realized that finding her mother was only the beginning of their story together. They would need to learn how to be family, how to build relationships that had been stolen from them, and how to heal from trauma that had lasted more than 20 years. But as she watched Isabella and Alexander tentatively reconnect, their hands finding each other with the muscle memory of a love that had never really ended, Elena felt something she'd never experienced before. The profound sense of belonging that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be with exactly the people who are meant to be part of your life. The conspiracy that had torn them apart had finally been exposed. The next phase would be about justice, healing, and discovering what it meant to be a family that had been stolen and then miraculously restored. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of Alexander's penthouse teaching Isabella how to make Carmen's famous arroz con pollo, while autumn sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The scene would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. 3 generations of women working together, sharing recipes and stories while the smell of saffron and cilantro
filled a space that had been designed for business entertainment, but was slowly being transformed into something that resembled a home. Carmen Morales had been the first person Elena called after Isabella's release from Serenity Hills, needing to explain to the woman who'd raised her that the family was about to expand in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the meaning of parenthood. The conversation had been one of the most difficult of Elena's life, not because Carmen had been angry or jealous, but because her response had been so characteristically generous. "Mija," Carmen had said through tears that Elena could hear even over the phone, "I always knew this day might come. Roberto and I, we'd prayed that if your birth parents were alive somewhere, they would find their way back to you. This woman, this Isabella, she needs you now more than we do. But remember, families aren't just about blood. You will always be our daughter, and now you have the blessing of being her daughter too." The integration of Isabella into Elena's existing life had been both easier and more complex than anyone had anticipated. Isabella had emerged from 23 years of institutionalization with her essential self intact, but with gaps in her knowledge and experience that made simple activities feel overwhelming. She'd never used a smartphone, had never shopped in a modern grocery store, had never navigated the subway system that Elena took for granted. But she'd also retained her intelligence, her curiosity, and her capacity for love that had sustained her through decades of enforced isolation. Alexander had purchased a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, close enough to Elena's Queens apartment that they could see each other regularly, but far enough from his Manhattan penthouse that Isabella could have space to rediscover who she was outside of institutional life. The house had a garden where Isabella could continue growing orchids, a library where she could catch up on 23 years of missed reading, an art studio where she'd begun painting again, watercolors of landscapes she remembered from before her imprisonment, and increasingly, portraits of the daughter she was finally getting to know. The integration of Isabella into Elena's existing life had been both easier and more complex than anyone had anticipated. Isabella had emerged from 23 years of institutionalization with her essential self intact, but with gaps in her knowledge and experience that made simple activities feel overwhelming. She'd never used a smartphone, had never shopped in a modern grocery store, had never navigated the subway system that Elena took for granted. But she'd also retained her intelligence, her curiosity, and her capacity for love that had sustained her through decades of enforced isolation. The legal ramifications of the conspiracy had unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche.
Dr. Richard Blackwood, now 78 and suffering from advanced dementia, had been deemed unfit to stand trial, but his medical records and personal papers had provided a roadmap to the others involved in the conspiracy. Morrison, Blackwell and Associates had been disbanded, its partners facing criminal charges for conspiracy, falsification of records, and unlawful imprisonment. David Sinclair, the lawyer who'd tried to intimidate Elena, had agreed to testify against his former associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. The deeper they dug into the conspiracy, the more disturbing the scope became. Isabella hadn't been the only victim. The investigation had uncovered at least 6 other cases where wealthy men's inconvenient relatives or former lovers had been made to disappear into private facilities, their deaths faked or their mental health deliberately undermined to prevent them from causing embarrassment or financial complications. The scandal had made international headlines, leading to congressional hearings about the regulation of private medical facilities and the ease with which money could corrupt systems designed to protect vulnerable people. Elena had testified before a congressional subcommittee, her story becoming a symbol of the human cost of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining oversight over institutions that held power over people's lives. The experience had been terrifying and empowering simultaneously. Standing in a room full of politicians and reporters, telling the world about 23 years of separation and the conspiracy that had stolen her mother's freedom. I'm not asking for sympathy. I had a good childhood with people who loved me completely. But my biological mother lost more than 20 years of her life, imprisoned to protect a billionaire's reputation. How many other Isabella Santoses are there, hidden away in facilities across the country, forgotten by families who found them inconvenient? The question had sparked a national conversation about wealth, power, and accountability that was still ongoing 6 months later. Alexander had used his resources and influence to support legislative changes that would make such conspiracies more difficult in the future, establishing a foundation dedicated to investigating suspicious institutionalizations and providing legal support for families searching for missing relatives. But the public aspects of their story were less important to Elena than the private miracle of building relationships that had been thought impossible. Isabella was learning to be a mother to an adult daughter who'd already been shaped by other parents, other experiences, other dreams. Elena was learning to make space in her carefully ordered life for someone whose needs and perspectives were both foreign and familiar. And Alexander was discovering what it meant to be a father to a daughter who had inherited his determination and stubbornness along with Isabella's artistic sensibilities and emotional intelligence. The process hadn't been without challenges. Isabella struggled with anxiety in crowded places, after effects of decades in a controlled environment where every aspect of her life was regulated by others. Elena sometimes felt caught between worlds, her working-class upbringing with Carmen and Roberto, her newfound connection to Alexander's wealth and influence, and the responsibility she felt to help Isabella navigate a world that had changed dramatically during her imprisonment. There had been difficult conversations about money, about privilege, about what Elena owed to the adoptive parents who'd raised her versus the biological parents who'd been stolen from her. Alexander had wanted to immediately transfer significant wealth to Elena to make up for 25 years of not being able to provide for his daughter. But Elena had insisted on taking things slowly, on earning her place in his life rather than simply accepting it as a birthright. I need to know that our relationship is real, not just based on guilt or obligation, Elena had explained during one of their weekly dinners. If you want to help me, if you want to be part of my life, it has to be because of who I am now, not because of what was done to us 23 years ago. So they'd built their connection gradually, through shared meals and long conversations. Through Alexander attending Elena's art classes, she'd discovered a talent for pottery that Isabella insisted came from her side of the family. And Elena occasionally accompanying him to business functions where she was learning to navigate the social complexities of Manhattan's elite circles.
Isabella had been the bridge between them, helping Elena understand Alexander's driven personality while helping him appreciate Elena's independence and strength. "She's exactly what I hoped she would be," Isabella had told Alexander during one of their evening walks through Brooklyn Heights. "Strong enough to survive without us, but generous enough to include us in her life now that she can." The relationship between Isabella and Alexander had been even more complex to navigate. They were no longer the people they'd been 23 years ago. He was older, more powerful, but also more aware of how power could corrupt. She was marked by decades of institutional life, but also strengthened by surviving what should have destroyed her. They were learning to love each other again while acknowledging that they were essentially strangers who shared a powerful history and a daughter they were both still getting to know. Some evenings, Elena would find them sitting together in Isabella's garden, talking quietly about the life they might have built if the conspiracy hadn't torn them apart. Other times, she'd catch them looking at each other across a dinner table with the wonder of people who'd been given a second chance they'd never dared to hope for. The three of them had also begun the process of building relationships with Elena's extended family. Carmen and Roberto had embraced Isabella with the warmth they'd always shown toward people who needed love and acceptance. Roberto had taught Isabella how to fix a leaky faucet and change a car tire, practical skills she'd never needed in institutional life, but that represented independence and self-sufficiency. Carmen had included Isabella in the Sunday family dinners that were a cornerstone of the Morales family traditions, making room at a table that had always been open to anyone who needed a place to belong. Alexander's integration into the Morales family had been more awkward but no less meaningful. Roberto had been initially suspicious of the billionaire who'd suddenly appeared in his adopted daughter's life, but he'd been won over by Alexander's genuine respect for the parents who'd raised Elena and his obvious love for the woman he was still learning to know as his daughter. "You did good," Alexander had told Carmen and Roberto during one family dinner. "Elena is everything a parent could hope for. Kind, strong, intelligent, hardworking. You gave her values that no amount of money could buy." Carmen had simply nodded, her expression mixing pride and the kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime of understanding that love wasn't about possession or credit, but about wanting the best for the people you cared about, regardless of what that meant for yourself. As the afternoon wore on and the arroz con pollo simmered on the stove, Elena realized that the story that had begun with an impossible birthmark and a billionaire's disbelief had evolved into something much more complex and meaningful than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about solving a mystery or exposing a conspiracy. It was about the resilience of love across time and trauma, the possibility of healing even the most devastating wounds, and the truth that families could be both born and chosen. "Mija," Isabella said, using the term of endearment she'd learned from Carmen, "taste this and tell me if it needs more saffron." Elena accepted the spoon, tasting the rice that carried flavors from both her Puerto Rican heritage through Carmen and her own family tradition through Isabella. It was perfect. Complex, layered, exactly right for a family that had been assembled from pieces that shouldn't have fit together, but somehow created something beautiful and whole.
The morning of Elena's graduation from Columbia's School of Social Work dawned clear and bright, with May sunshine streaming through the windows of the Brooklyn Heights townhouse where Isabella had built her new life. Elena stood in front of the full-length mirror in what had once been a guest room but had become her second bedroom, adjusting the cap and gown that represented 2 years of intensive study, fieldwork, and personal growth that had transformed her from a waitress seeking answers into a professional advocate for families torn apart by institutional failures. Isabella appeared in the doorway, carrying a small wrapped box and wearing the kind of smile that had become familiar over the past 2 years, joy mixed with the lingering wonder of someone who still couldn't quite believe she was free to participate in her daughter's milestones. "I have something for you,"
she said, settling on the edge of the bed. It's not much, but it's been waiting for this day for a very long time. Inside the box was a delicate silver chain with a pendant shaped like a crescent moon with a small star beside it, an exact replica of the birthmark that had started their entire journey. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she fastened it around Elena's neck. I had this made during my first week at Serenity Hills. I convinced one of the art therapy instructors to help me work with silver wire. I kept it hidden for 23 years, holding on to the hope that someday I'd have a daughter to give it to. Even when they told me you were dead, some part of me couldn't let go of the belief that you were out there somewhere, growing up, becoming the amazing woman you were meant to be. Elena touched the pendant, feeling the weight of 2 decades of faith and love compressed into a small piece of jewelry that represented so much more than decoration. Mom, it's perfect. I'll wear it always. The word Mom still felt new and precious, even after 2 years. Elena had worried initially about how Carmen would feel about sharing that title, but her adoptive mother had embraced the complexity with characteristic grace. Love multiplies, mija. It doesn't divide. You calling Isabella Mom doesn't take anything away from me. It just means you have more people to love and more people who love you. Downstairs, the townhouse was filling with an unlikely but harmonious gathering of people who'd become Elena's extended family. Carmen and Roberta were in the kitchen with Alexander, the 3 of them working together to prepare a celebration brunch that combined Puerto Rican, Mexican, and what Alexander laughingly called generic wealthy person culinary traditions. Dr. Chen was setting up a camera to document the day, having become not just the genealogist who'd solved their case, but a close family friend who'd watched Elena's transformation with professional pride and personal affection. Stella had closed the diner for the morning to attend the graduation, bringing with her 3 of Elena's former co-workers who'd become invested in her success story. Margaret Flynn had driven down from her retirement community in Florida, eager to see the happy ending to a story that had haunted her for decades. Even Henry from Bernardin was there, having developed an unexpected friendship with Alexander based on their shared appreciation for Elena's strength and determination. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, as Elena came downstairs, his voice carrying the kind of paternal pride that had taken 2 years to develop, but now felt as natural as breathing. He was wearing a navy suit instead of his usual business attire, a small concession to the informality of a family celebration that represented how much his priorities had shifted since discovering he had a daughter. "I think so," Elena replied, though the truth was more complicated. Graduation represented the culmination of an educational journey that had been both personally meaningful and professionally strategic. Her master's thesis had focused on institutional oversight and family reunification, using her own experience as a case study for systemic reforms that could prevent other families from enduring similar separations. The research had been emotionally challenging, requiring her to relive trauma while analyzing it academically, but it had also been healing in ways she hadn't expected. More importantly, graduation marked the beginning of her career as a family advocate working with the Whitmore Foundation, the organization Alexander had established to investigate suspicious institutionalizations and support families searching for missing relatives. Elena would be starting work the following Monday as the Foundation's Director of Family Services, a position that would allow her to use her personal experience to help others navigate the complex systems that could either reunite families or tear them apart forever. "Dr. Elena Morales Santos Whitmore," Isabella said, trying out the hyphenated name Elena had chosen to honor all 3 families that had shaped her identity. "It has a nice ring to it." Elena had wrestled with the name question for months, ultimately deciding that her identity was too complex to be captured by any single surname. Morales honored Carmen and Roberto, who gave her the foundation of love and values that carried her through every challenge. Santos connected her to Isabella and the heritage that had been hidden for 23 years. Whitmore acknowledged Alexander and the resources that were allowing her to build a career dedicated to helping other families reunite. The graduation ceremony at Columbia was a blur of speeches, music, and the organized chaos of hundreds of families celebrating educational achievements that represented years of sacrifice and determination. Elena walked across the stage to receive her diploma, but her attention was focused on the audience where her extended family was cheering with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for sporting events.
Later, at the celebration brunch, Dr. Chen stood to offer a toast that captured the journey they'd all traveled together.
2 years ago, Elena was a waitress with questions about her identity. Isabella was a prisoner in a system designed to silence her. Alexander was a successful businessman who didn't know he had a daughter. Today, Elena is beginning a career that will help hundreds of other families find their way back to each other. Isabella is a published artist whose paintings hang in galleries across the city. And Alexander has discovered that being a father and using his wealth to help others brings more satisfaction than any business deal ever could. She raised her glass of champagne. To families lost and found. To justice delayed but not denied. And to the truth that love is stronger than any conspiracy designed to keep people apart. 5 years later. Elena's office at the Whitmore Foundation overlooked Union Square, with windows that faced east toward the rising sun, a deliberate choice that reminded her daily that each morning brought new possibilities for families to be reunited, for truth to emerge from decades of darkness, for healing to begin even when hope seemed impossible. The foundation had grown exponentially since Elena joined as Director of Family Services. What had begun as a response to their own family's trauma had evolved into a comprehensive organization with investigators, lawyers, social workers, and advocates working cases across the country. They'd successfully reunited over 200 families, exposed corruption in dozens of private facilities, and lobbied for legislative changes that made it much more difficult for powerful people to make inconvenient relatives disappear. Elena's most recent case had been particularly complex. A tech billionaire's autistic son who'd been institutionalized against his will when he'd threatened to expose his father's tax evasion schemes. Working with Dr. Chen and a team of legal advocates, Elena had spent 6 months building a case that ultimately freed the young man and led to federal charges against his father. The reunion between the son and his mother, who'd spent 5 years believing her child was receiving necessary care, had been one of the most emotionally rewarding moments of Elena's career. Another successful reunion, Elena told Isabella during their weekly lunch at a cafe near Isabella's art studio in Soho. Isabella's paintings had gained recognition not just for their technical skill, but for their emotional power, landscapes that somehow captured the experience of loss and recovery, portraits that revealed the resilience of people who'd survived institutional trauma. "I saw the news coverage," Isabella replied, pride evident in her voice. The mother looked so relieved. "It reminded me of how I felt that first day when you and Alexander found me at Serenity Hills, like I was waking up from a nightmare that had lasted so long I'd forgotten what normal life felt like." Isabella had thrived in the 5 years since her release. She'd learned to navigate the modern world with determination and curiosity, embracing technology and social media while maintaining the patience and wisdom she'd developed during her forced isolation. Her relationship with Alexander had evolved into something deeper than their original romance, a partnership built on shared trauma, mutual respect, and their joint commitment to Elena's happiness and success. They'd married quietly the previous year, not because they felt pressure to legitimize their relationship, but because they wanted to publicly commit to the future they were building together. Elena had walked Isabella down the aisle at the small ceremony in Central Park, giving away the mother she'd spent 23 years not knowing she was missing to the man who'd spent the same time not knowing he was a father. "Speaking of good news," Isabella continued, her eyes sparkling with the kind of mischief that Elena had learned to recognize. "Alexander and I have something to tell you. We're thinking about expanding the family." Elena nearly choked on her coffee. Are you serious? Mom, you're 51 years old." "Not that kind of expanding, though thank you for making me feel ancient. We're talking about adoption. There's a teenage girl, Sophia, who's been in foster care for 3 years.
Her mother was institutionalized under suspicious circumstances similar to what happened to me, and her father is unknown. She's bright, artistic, and completely lost in a system that doesn't know what to do with a smart, angry kid who asks too many questions about why her mother disappeared. Elena's heart expanded as she realized what her parents were proposing. "You want to adopt her? We want to give her what Carmen and Roberto gave you, a family that will love her unconditionally while she figures out who she's supposed to be. And selfishly, we want to give you a sister who might understand the complexity of having multiple families and identities." The idea was perfect in ways that Elena was still processing. She'd often felt isolated by her unique circumstances, caught between worlds that didn't quite intersect naturally. Having a sister who had experienced similar family disruption might provide the kind of understanding that even loving parents couldn't fully offer. When do I get to meet her? 10 years later. Sophia Whitmore graduated law school on a spring morning that reminded Elena powerfully of her own graduation 10 years earlier. The family had grown and evolved in ways that would have been impossible to predict, but the core bonds of love and mutual support had only strengthened with time.
Sophia had indeed become the sister Elena had never known she needed. At 25, she was fierce, brilliant, and completely dedicated to using her legal education to hold institutions accountable for the harm they inflicted on vulnerable people. She'd spent her summers working at the Whitmore Foundation, learning from Elena while developing her own approach to advocacy that combined legal strategy with emotional intelligence. Alexander, now 72, had officially retired from business to focus full-time on the foundation and his family. His hair was completely silver, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that time with loved ones was more valuable than any amount of money. Isabella's art had gained international recognition, with her paintings displayed in museums as powerful statements about survival, resilience, and the possibility of healing from institutional trauma. Carmen and Roberto, now in their 70s, had become beloved grandparents to Sophia and devoted supporters of the foundation's work. Roberto had learned to use social media to share stories about successful family reunifications, while Carmen had become the unofficial family coordinator who made sure everyone attended Sunday dinners and remembered important anniversaries. Elena herself had evolved from family advocate to national expert on institutional oversight, testifying regularly before Congress and working with international organizations to develop standards that would prevent the kind of systematic abuses their family had endured. She'd written a book about her experience that had become required reading in social work programs across the country. But the most significant change had been the addition of Elena's own family. She'd married David Kim, an investigative journalist who'd initially contacted her for a story about the foundation, but had stayed for the woman behind the organization. Their twin daughters, Isabella and Carmen, were 3 years old and showed early signs of inheriting the family's stubborn determination and artistic sensibilities. "Tia Elena," Sophia said after her graduation ceremony, using the Spanish term of endearment that had become natural despite their unconventional family structure, "I've been thinking about something. The foundation has been incredibly successful at helping individual families, but I think we need to start thinking bigger. What if we used our influence to create a completely new kind of oversight system, something that would make it impossible for powerful people to hide inconvenient relatives ever again?" Elena smiled at her sister's ambition, recognizing the same drive that had led her to pursue social work and advocacy. "What did you have in mind?" "A national database of institutional placements with mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight, legal protections for whistleblowers like Margaret Flynn, and most importantly, a system that gives institutionalized people regular access to outside advocates who can verify that their placement is medically necessary and legally sound." The proposal was ambitious, potentially requiring federal legislation and billions of dollars in implementation costs. But Elena had learned that seemingly impossible changes could happen when the right people were willing to fight for them long enough and smart enough. "Draft me a proposal. Let's see what we can accomplish." 15 years later, the Sophia Whitmore Act was signed into law on a crisp October morning, establishing the most comprehensive oversight system for institutional care in American history. Elena watched the signing ceremony from the front row of the White House's East Room, surrounded by family members who'd all played roles in the long campaign for legislative change. The law required independent advocacy for every person placed in long-term institutional care, created a national database to track placements and prevent people from disappearing into private facilities, and established severe criminal penalties for falsifying medical records or manipulating institutional placements for non-medical reasons. Most importantly, it funded a network of advocates trained to identify cases where people were being held against their will or under false pretenses. 15 years ago, I was a waitress who broke a wine glass and accidentally discovered that everything I thought I knew about my life was wrong. Today, we're ensuring that no other family will lose decades to the kind of conspiracy that separated my mother and I. This law represents the truth that love is stronger than greed, that families are stronger than the institutions that try to tear them apart, and that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. President Martinez smiled as she handed Elena the pen used to sign the legislation. Miss Morales Santos Whitmore, your family story has inspired a generation of advocates and reminded all of us that the most important work we do is protecting the people who can't protect themselves. After the signing ceremony, Elena's extended family gathered for dinner at the same restaurant where their story had begun, Bernardin, though it was now under new management and had been renovated several times since that evening when a broken wine glass had changed everything. Henri had retired years earlier, but he'd returned for this special occasion, eager to serve the family whose reunion had begun at his table. Isabella, now 61, raised her glass of wine, the same vintage that had shattered 15 years earlier, though this time no one's hands were trembling. To Elena, who turned our trauma into triumph. To Sophia, who's going to change the world one law at a time. To Alexander, who learned that being a father was more important than being a billionaire. To Carmen and Roberto, who taught us that families are built on love, not biology. And to everyone who helped us find our way back to each other.
To families lost and found, Alexander added, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold. To truth, Sophia said, thinking of all the families who would be protected by the law that bore her name. To love that survives everything, Elena concluded, looking around the table at the faces of people who'd become her anchor in a world that had initially seemed determined to keep them apart. As the evening wound down and family members began saying their goodbyes, Elena stepped outside onto Fifth Avenue and looked up at the lights of Manhattan twinkling against the dark sky. 15 years ago, she'd been a young woman with questions she couldn't answer and a birthmark that connected her to a mystery she couldn't solve. Tonight, she was a wife, mother, advocate, and author whose work had directly impacted thousands of families while building the kind of life she'd never dared to dream was possible. The crescent moon pendant that Isabella had given her on graduation day caught the streetlight as Elena walked toward the car where David and their daughters were waiting. The birthmark that had started everything was hidden beneath her sleeve, but Elena touched it gently through the fabric, remembering the moment when Alexander Whitmore first saw it and spoke the words that had changed everything. Impossible. She died 20 years ago. Some impossibilities, Elena had learned, were just truths waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Some deaths were illusions created by people who valued power more than love. And some families were strong enough to survive decades of separation and emerge not just intact, but transformed into something more beautiful and resilient than they'd ever been before. The real miracle wasn't that they'd found each other. It was that they'd learned to be a family despite every obstacle that had been placed in their path. Love, Elena had discovered, was indeed stronger than any conspiracy designed to keep people apart. As the car pulled away from the restaurant toward home, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from a new client. Another family searching for a missing relative. Another mystery that needs solving. Another opportunity to turn someone else's impossible situation into a reunion that would prove, once again, that hope was always worth holding on to. The work continued. The family endured. And somewhere in the city that never slept, other people with birthmarks and broken wine glasses were about to discover that their impossible stories were just beginning. Subscribe to Waitress Chronicles, where silence is never forgotten.